Good day. Yesterday, Wednesday, was supposed to be the day when the Western powers would assert their strength of purpose and unity and firmness against the Russians in the conflict, as they insist it is, over Ukraine. The Russians, I ought to say, insist that the issues under discussion, the question under discussion, is not Ukraine, it is their quest for legally binding security guarantees over NATO's eastward expansion. Two quite different conceptual issues, but as I said, it is Ukraine that the West has insisted on making the big issue in this matter. Anyway, as I said, Wednesday was supposed to be the day when the Western powers all came together and made it clear that they were united, stood side by side with each other against the Russian bear and in support of Ukraine. Well, they comprehensively botched it. We got two diametrically opposite speeches. Well, not exactly speeches. One was a press conference by President Biden, and the other a speech by French President Emmanuel Macron, which went in diametrically opposite directions. And this has come after days of discussions and comments which make it increasingly clear that there is in fact growing divisions in the Western camp about how to deal with the situation and arguments behind the scenes. Now, before I deal with what Biden and Macron respectively had to say, I'm going to touch on one of the weirdest documents that has appeared over the course of this confected crisis, and that is a very weird and very bizarre article written by the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. In it, Ben Wallace disregards all the promises given to Russia at the end of the Cold War, and by the way, in the first year after the Cold War ended, that NATO would not be expanded eastward. He insists that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, something which of course the Russians won't accept any longer after the NATO wars in Afghanistan, in Libya, and in Yugoslavia, which of course Ben Wallace entirely ignores. He comes up with an account of Russian history, which, to be straightforward about it, I think is so completely wrong and so misconceived that it's most likely to infuriate the Russians rather than pacify them, and which, in terms of people who know Russian history, will convince no one. For example, he seems to want to imply that Ukraine and Russia have been separated from each other for much the greatest part of Ukraine's history, when, as the Canadian historian Paul Robinson has pointed out, Ukraine as an independent state only existed for a few months in 1918 and since the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. It's a classic example of how somebody who is not an intellectual should not act as if he is, and someone who is not a historian should not venture into detailed discussions of history, particularly when they are about someone else's history. But far and away, the most interesting point about Ben Wallace's article, the one that stood out for me, the one that, in my opinion, should attract the most attention, but in some ways doesn't, is its opening paragraph. And this is what that opening paragraph in Ben Wallace's article says. It says the following: I have lost count of how many times recently I've had to explain the meaning of the English term straw man to my European colleagues. That is because the best living, breathing straw man at the moment is the Kremlin's claim to be under threat from NATO. Now, what is that if not an admission of Western division? Someone is apparently making arguments about this whole crisis, what Ben Wallace apparently believes are straw man arguments. And this article which he has written is clearly not intended to respond to Vladimir Putin's article about Ukraine of several months ago. It is clearly part of some sort of intense internal debate which is taking place within NATO and within the NATO structures. And I'm going to venture a guess as to who it is exactly that Ben Wallace is arguing with later in this program. But let's first note the fact that this article, with all its absurdities and historical misunderstandings, is part of an internal argument within NATO, and Ben Wallace himself acknowledges the fact in its opening paragraph, in fact, in its opening sentence. But let's move on. Let's look at the situation from a somewhat different perspective. Let's focus now on those people who really matter, because despite all the talk about the British supplying thousands of light anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainians, anti-tank weapons which, if they were supplied in their thousands, would be completely useless to the Ukrainians, but which absolutely have not been supplied in their thousands, because the British military, as everybody knows, doesn't have stocks of that size. But putting all that aside, putting the fact that, the British like to claim that they're a big player in this matter, the country that really matters, the only country that matters here, is the United States. This is the country that is currently negotiating with the Russians, which is talking to the Russians, whose foreign minister, Tony Blinken, is going to meet Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Geneva tomorrow. I would add that the Germans also have a significant role to play in this matter, and we can see how German diplomacy is being increasingly active. I discussed Annalena Baerbock's visit to Moscow in a program I did a little while ago. But as I said, it is the Americans who, certainly as far as the Russians are concerned, are the major players. And the President of the United States, no less, the head of the executive, the man who is in overall charge, he delivered a press conference at this crucial moment, and he was supposedly going to give a strong line about what the United States is going to do, its strong position supporting Ukraine, and it was a car crash. It was yet another example of Biden, I'm afraid, losing track of what he wanted to say over the course of this press conference. And the words about this are almost surreal. So let's unpack it. I'm providing a link so that you can read the words themselves, the kind of things that Biden was saying. But first of all, he talks about the situation. He talks about the enormously high economic consequences for the Russians if they invade Ukraine. And then almost the first thing he says, almost the first point he makes, is that he thinks that nonetheless Putin is going to invade Ukraine. Doesn't really say quite why he thinks that. It's clear that it's only a guess, because of course he doesn't really know. And then he goes on to say something even more bizarre. He goes on to say that, and I'm going to actually quote the words here because they're so strange. He says, "I think what you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not to do, etc." Now, some people thought that what Biden was doing was almost giving the Russians a green light to carry out a minor incursion in Ukraine. Certainly the Ukrainians have interpreted it in this way, and they're deeply upset about the fact, and they've made it clear that they found this press conference of Biden's extremely unhelpful. But in fact, what Biden is doing in these words is he is admitting divisions about sanctions within NATO, and about the fact that NATO, the Western powers, the Europeans and the Americans cannot even agree. They cannot define what Russian aggression against Ukraine would actually amount to. So he comes up with this mangled phrase which already suggests that he doesn't quite understand he's almost giving this impression that a minor Russian incursion, what is a minor Russian incursion into Ukraine, that it wouldn't have consequences. And then he comes up with some very bizarre comments like Russia has control over the energy supply that Europe absorbs. Well, guess what? That money that they earn from that makes up about 45% of the economy, except it doesn't, not remotely. Oil and gas, the Russian energy complex accounts for around 10% of Russia's GDP. So 45%, he's clearly fundamentally wrong about all of this. So again, he's highlighting his extraordinary ignorance about this matter. And then he in effect admits that the idea of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT has been taken off the table, and that what's now going to happen is that there's going to be instead restrictions on Russian banks' ability to use the dollar. He's going to try to block big Russian banks from operating in dollars. Now, the United States can do that. It does have the ability to prevent its currency from being used by the banks that it's sanctioned. But of course, the Russians have been de-dollarizing frantically for years, and the dollar now forms only a very small part of its reserves. This sanction would only be effective if the Europeans were prepared to extend it to transactions in euros as well. But there's no hint in this press conference that that's what the Europeans are prepared to do. And of course, if they're not prepared to extend it to euros, and by the way, the largest block of money in the Russian central bank's reserves are euros. If the Europeans are not prepared are going to try and block euros from being used by Russian banks, then that, of course, again leaves open the question of how, in that case, do the Europeans pay Russia for their gas and oil. So already we start to see doubts, problems, issues here, and frankly uncertainties. And it's beginning to look, Biden doesn't mention blocking the use of euros in Russian transactions, Russian oil and gas transactions. So this threat suddenly starts to look a lot less impressive than it had previously. But then, of course, it gets weirder still, because he goes into an extraordinarily intricate and confusing discussion about Russian policy, and he tries to enter Putin's head. He talks weirdly about the fact that Putin supposedly is trying to position Russia between the United States, between the West and China. Again, one wonders whether he's been properly briefed about the relationship between China and Russia. If he had been, he would know otherwise. And he talks weirdly also about the way in which the Russians, about Putin supposedly regrets the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he then makes some very strange comments, like he has 8 time zones, a burning tundra that will not freeze again naturally, a situation where he has a lot of oil and gas, but he's trying to find his place in the world between China and the West. And so I'm not sure that he has, David, I'm not sure that he is certain what he's going to do. My guess is he will move in. My guess. President of the United States in a press conference. He's guessing. He's guessing what another foreign leader is going to do. He has to do something. I mean, it is so weird. It is so strange. It is so bizarre that Vladimir Putin, if he was watching this press conference, which is unlikely, by the way, because Putin has had a full day talking to the president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, who is in Moscow at the moment. And besides, by the time this press conference took place, it would have been very late at night in Moscow. But assuming that Putin was watching this press conference, I think he would have been completely bemused and would have come away feeling that the President of the United States is not only disastrously badly briefed about things, but that he is also completely unsure and is guessing always about Putin's intentions, which is, of course, exactly what Putin presumably wants. Now, can I just say that what Biden has also done by guessing that that Putin is indeed intending to attack Ukraine, is that he's destabilizing Ukraine's economy. There's been complaints now from a senior Ukrainian official that this whole situation is being talked up to a ridiculous extent and that panic is therefore starting to take hold in Ukraine. And the president of Ukraine has, Vladimir Zelensky, is now complaining about runs on shops and about a run on Ukraine's banks, all because of an invasion scare. And that other Ukrainian official, a member of Zelensky's parliamentary party, he's also come out and said that, in fact, the situation is no more dangerous than it was in the spring, and that the whole story that was being spread a few days ago about the Russians evacuating their embassy from Kiev and closing their consulates across Ukraine, that was straightforward fake news. So you see that the Ukrainians themselves are becoming increasingly concerned by these reckless phrases from Biden. The suggestion that a minor incursion isn't going to be such a problem, and the fact that they're guessing, the Americans are guessing, that there's going to be a war, and something which, as I said, is causing alarm in Ukraine itself, amongst the Ukrainian people, and which is now starting to take its toll on Ukraine's economy. Well, was there anything good out of this press conference? Well, in fact, there was. There, again, in a way that I suspect Ukrainians won't like. For example, Biden all but ruled out any possibility of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. He said quite clearly, and his words were as follows: the likelihood that Ukraine is going to join NATO in the near term is not very likely, based on much more work they have to do in terms of democracy and a few other things going on there, and whether or not the major allies in the West would vote to bring Ukraine in right now. And then he also all but confirmed that the United States is prepared to negotiate with the Russians on intermediate missiles in Europe. And in his words, so there's room to work if he wants to do that. But I think, as usual, he's going to, well, I probably shouldn't go any further, but I think it will hurt him badly. Anyway, I would add that, from a Ukrainian point of view, hearing Biden essentially pour cold water again on Ukraine's prospects of joining NATO must be deeply demoralizing. And this comes after a complete lack of enthusiasm from Biden on Ukraine ever joining NATO at all. He says, we have a number of treaties internationally and in Europe that suggest that you get to choose who you want to be with. But in other words, it's all down to treaties. It's not really something that he terribly wants to see. He doesn't really want to see Ukraine in NATO at all. That's the implication behind this sentence. By the way, in saying that there are treaties that make it that you mean that you get to choose who you want to be with, that incidentally is also wrong, but I will leave that discussion for another day. So here we are, an extraordinary, confused, muddled press conference address from Biden. On the one hand, he essentially says Ukraine isn't going to join NATO anytime soon. He's prepared to talk about missiles with the Russians. Perhaps he's prepared to talk about other things. On the other hand, he has deflated Ukraine's hopes, given the impression that a minor incursion by the Russians wouldn't really matter, cast doubts on the unity of the Western alliance, and in effect admitted that the sanctions, the big sanction, the sanction of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, that has been abandoned, and that the sanctions that are left are sanctions which will target some Russian banks, perhaps not all of them, but which will presumably allow for some payment mechanism in order that the Europeans can continue to pay for their oil and gas supplies. And at the same time, as Biden has done all of that, he's highlighted his profound ignorance, and perhaps the profound ignorance of the United States about Russian realities. He thinks absurdly that the energy sector accounts for 45% of the Russian economy, which, as I said, is completely wrong. And he also appears to think that the Russians are trying to position themselves between China and the West, when anybody who's followed my programs and reads the Russian and Chinese media at all attentively would know that, in fact, the Chinese and the Russians have, in effect, forged a strategic partnership which, as they say, is better than an alliance with each other. So a train wreck of a press conference, one which has caused enormous dismay across in Ukraine, and one which has simply highlighted the extent to which the President of the United States is simply not on top of this issue. If the intention was to project a firm, strong president, a president like, say, JFK, John Kennedy, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if that had been the idea behind this press conference, well, it managed to do the opposite. So that's Biden. But now we come to Macron. And Macron came along and gave a speech to the European Parliament. We don't have yet a full transcript, but we're told it's coming. But there's media commentaries, and of course you can also watch the whole thing on YouTube and elsewhere. Now, briefly, this was Macron's speech at the start of France chairing the European Union. France has now taken over the chairing of meetings of the European Council, of the various subcommittees. France is now, in a sense, in the driving seat in the European Union. And this is partly Macron coming along, setting out what France's priorities are. And in fact, he went into an extraordinary discussion about France, Europe, and Russia. And he talked about the fact that Europe and Russia are at the moment interdependent, that Europe depends on Russia for its energy. He wants that to end one day, but he also said that it is impossible, it's most unwise, it's impractical, in fact, to create a Europe without Russia, and that, in fact, there has to be a complete reimagining of Europe's security architecture. And he spoke also about the fact that France wants to see a European dialogue with Russia separate from that which the United States is currently conducting. Now, all that is very well and good, and I come back now to that weird article by Ben Wallace, and Ben Wallace's effective admission that there are arguments within NATO, and that there are what he calls straw man arguments about NATO's aggressiveness and threat to Russia and Russian perceptions of all of this, those kind of arguments which Ben Wallace feels that he has to respond to, but which are coming from amongst NATO member states. And I think after this speech of Macron, it's almost indisputable that it is the French that the British are primarily arguing with. The French feel clearly that this is a runaway train. They want to bring it under control. They want to start a dialogue. They don't trust the way the Americans are conducting this dialogue. Macron also clearly wants to find some way of resolving the Ukrainian crisis. He talked about reviving the Normandy 4 mechanism, which is supposed to steer the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis on the basis of the Minsk agreement. He talks about the importance of creating a good relationship between the West and Russia, between Europe and Russia, and he wants Europe, and by extension France, to lead it. Well, all that is interesting. It's good. I'm sure, by the way, that he has much more support within Europe. Macron has much more support within Europe than is being widely admitted. That Greece, for example, I'm pretty sure, is essentially quietly supporting these moves. I suspect other EU states, Croatia, for example, whose foreign minister recently went to Moscow, other EU states, Italy probably, are also quietly supporting the French position. The trouble is, as is so often the case with Macron, he comes along, he makes these speeches, but he never goes beyond generalizations. He never actually deviates ultimately from the West's standard positions, its dogmas. He still appears to insist, for example, in the speech that any country should be free to join NATO, which, as we know, for the Russians is now a red line, specifically where Ukraine is concerned, but also in general. And he still talks very much the language that the Russians are the people who are ultimately to blame for the whole problem. So, unsurprisingly, what he has managed is that he's annoyed everybody. The European Commission, the European leadership, has been busy, apparently, phoning the Americans, assuring them that Macron was talking out of line and that he hadn't cleared his speech with the Commission or with other EU leaders. By the way, I very strongly doubt that that is the case. And at the same time, the Russians have again made it known that at the moment they're not interested in a dialogue with the Europeans about European security issues. As far as they are concerned, the only dialogue that they're prepared to conduct at the moment is with the United States, and they're continuing to wait for the US to come back with a proper response to their draft treaties. So, Macron, in contrast to Biden, comes up with a speech that is interesting, intellectually coherent, covers vast areas, is well structured, is philosophically polished, but which, as is always the case with him, never actually puts anything concrete down on the table. There is nothing there that the Russians, what would induce the Russians to come along and say to Macron, well, this is what you want to do. You want a dialogue with us. We're prepared to engage you in that dialogue because you have interesting ideas, interesting proposals that we can work with and we can negotiate around. One gets the sense with Macron that fundamentally he is deeply skeptical about the whole thrust of Western policy towards Russia. He thinks, as I said, that it is a runaway train. He senses that this is a disaster and that the Ukrainian affair has been disastrously badly managed. And yet, at the end of the day, he is too nervous of annoying the Americans and the British and perhaps the Germans to make a strong alternative push, where de Gaulle would have simply come out and said straightforwardly that US policy towards Russia is wrong, that France supports the principle of a new security architecture which might involve legally binding security guarantees for Russia, and that the nature of those legally binding security guarantees obviously is up for negotiation, but that the Russians are being perfectly reasonable to demand them. Where de Gaulle would have done that, Macron goes up to the edge, but he's not prepared to take the plunge. And this is really very sad because, of course, if there's one country in Europe other than Germany which could come out and act in that way, it is France. The one positive effect of being in the Eurozone is that if the French were to act in that kind of way, their currency would not be under speculative attack in the way that it might have been if it had been done by an earlier generation of French leaders. Because, of course, a speculative attack on the euro would not just affect France, it would affect the entire European Union. And as I said, there's no doubt at all that other European governments, Greece, Croatia, probably Italy, perhaps even Spain, quietly agree with many of the things that Macron is saying. I suspect that what they are looking to is for France to take that lead. They feel individually that they're too weak to do it by themselves. But if the French came along and led them, if Macron came along and led them, then they would follow him. But, as I said, he's nervous. His great Napoleonic poses are, in the end, just that. They're just a pose, and he's not prepared to take that plunge and do what other French leaders, an earlier generation of French leaders, de Gaulle, Pompidou, even Giscard, might have done, and annoy the Americans and the British, maybe, upset the Germans to some extent, perhaps also, but actually lead that strong body of opinion within the European Union and within NATO that on this topic might be prepared to support and follow France. So here we are, a British Defence Secretary who attempts to show that he's this great historian and intellectual and gets it all wrong, and in doing so exposes the fact that there are arguments and quarrels within NATO about the relationship with Russia. A US president who is all over the place, who can't string a sentence together, who speculates absurdly about what might be in Putin's head, who makes guesses he shouldn't make, who has also, in effect, inadvertently blurted out the fact that there are divisions in NATO, and who has all but admitted that the option of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT has been taken off the table. And a vain, conceited, though not unintelligent, in fact in some ways highly intelligent, French president who ultimately lacks the courage to do what he thinks is right. Has there ever been a time when the leadership of the Western powers has been more dire? The Chinese and the Russians, who are due to have a major summit meeting with each other on the 4th of February, must be looking at all of this and shaking their heads. Well, there we are. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also join us. Remember to join us on Locals, where we have a thriving community and where I do live streams now every Wednesday. And you can also publish your exclusive content there and participate in the work of our thriving community on Locals. And you can find us on various other platforms also: BitChute, Rumble, Library, ODYSEE, SuperU. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by coming to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there, our famous magic mugs and all the rest. And again, thank you for joining me today. Please remember to press the like button if you've liked this video. Please remember also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and have a very good day.